Hello and welcome to Radical Engagements. And while this is technically a separate article or series of letters in this case, I would make sure you watch or at least read James Turley's The Antinomies of Georg Lukács, or watch the Radical Engagements on that article where I go through my responses to it. I have some mild critiques and a lot of agreement with it. But today we're going to talk about the exchange of letters between Chris Cutrone and James Turley on that article. That's going to lead us to an article by Lawrence Parker, and then Cutrone's response to that, which will then take us to Mike McNair's summation of the debate, and then probably another article by Cutrone. And I'm doing this for a variety of reasons. I've already go over them. This is part of the CPGB Provisional Committee is in its publication, The Weekly Worker, is crucial to the Marxist Unity Group and Cosmonaut Magazine, and I'm going to be gradually incorporating more of their work as well, including also doing more Bordiga, classic Marx, and Marx essays. I have to go back and do the secondary sources on the critique of the Goethe program. There's a lot coming up in the next 4 to 5 months, including some things you're probably not expecting. Nonetheless, this is part of this series where I get into this to kind of, parse a few differences between these two groups that I am been tangential to. One of them I was a member of, and a thinker who I both respect and profoundly disagree with. And I think in covering these older essays, these are all from like 10 or 11 years ago, I can point out what I think are some pretty big flaws, at least in argumentation style, if not in substance, by both sides in this debate, and hopefully clarify my own position and why I feel that way. I'm also going to go back and do a few responses to Chris's other comments, not in this episode, but probably towards the end of this series on this round. And I'm going to do more Cutrone essays. I have a bunch of essays planned, and including more stuff on EndNotes and Bordiga. So be looking out for it. Okay, all the preliminary aside, let's get into text. I'm going to put a link in the show notes. This is a letter sent by Chris Cutrone, published in January of 2003 to the Weekly Worker. It is a response to the Antinomies of Georg Lukács, which had been released a week before in a supplement on the Weekly Worker. And we're going to go into what it says here. James Turley, the Antinomies of Georg Lukács, January 24th, 2003, upholds Althusser against Lukács and goes for a certain New Left doxa while claiming that the New Left was essentially Lukácsian. Okay. This is shorthand and somewhat forgivable as shorthand, but it's polemical, and we're going to have to acknowledge that. But it also actually doesn't tell me anything. So goes for certain New Left doxa, so certain New Left beliefs. Which ones? Chris? Which ones? While claiming the New Left was essentially Lukácsian. The issue is going to be, and we'll get to this, I haven't read ahead, so I don't know what all is coming up on this one, is that the New Left had Althusserian and Lukácsian strains. The whole humanist, anti-humanist debate was something that the New Left participated in, was a defining feature of different factors in it. Particularly E.P. Thompson's debate with Althusser, but even other Lukácsians. So Thompson wasn't exactly a Lukácsian, more a Marxist humanist, small m, small h. So when we talk about the New Left, there's a variety of different tendencies there, and using that as a standpoint for those tendencies is fair in that there are similarities going on. Response to official Soviet communism, frustration with official communist parties being stultified at the time, an origin in America that wasn't even particularly Marxist. But I don't know much from that statement. So let's see if Cliff clarifies. Indeed, this is the materialism versus idealism dispute, as filtered through the New Left, such as that the Lacanian Heideggerian trajectory of Althusser, Foucault et al. Becomes what stands for materialism, and the Marxist Hegelian Frankfurt School trajectory becomes idealism. I mean, that's a rebranding. Again, Chris likes to do the X equals Y game. All right. He's got a point here, but this is almost a genetic fallacy. Lacan and thus Heidegger are a heavy influence on Althusser. Althusser is a heavy influence on Foucault. Foucault takes this in different directions and loses most of the Marxism, but nonetheless, but Foucault wouldn't see himself in the materialist, and the Marxist Hegelian Frankfurt School trajectory becomes idealist. I have heard that said as shorthand by certain Maoists and whatnot over the ages. I've also heard them called neo-Kantians, which I don't think is true, except in very specific instances. But the trajectory of these thinkers doesn't prove one thing or another, particularly when you're pulling back at that large of a view. Like, this is just argument by genealogical lineage, ideological genealogical lineage. And it's reframing the humanism versus inhuman debates, or the scientific Marxism versus critical Marxism debates, both of which came out of the end of the New Left. See Alvin Guldner, or any of the debates around the structural versus humanist Marxist, the E.P. Thompson versus Althusser debates, for why this is kind of a problematic framework. But Cutrone does have a point that framing the New Left as essentially just Lukácsian and siding with Althusser without realizing or admitting that Althusser was also a major influence on different factions of the New Left, and in some ways is a product of it, particularly in France, does point out that it's a one-sided argument. So Chris isn't totally wrong here. In fact, he's not wrong at all. I just don't know what he's saying. I think his framework is so abstracted that beyond that point, it seems like a lot of names. Now, I know what these names are. I've read this material, although specific material is not mentioned. This is all lineage recitations. And this is a habit in academia that people get away with that I really think needs to stop. But nonetheless, let's move on. This involves some very distorting flattening of the issues. I can see that, actually. I think that's a fair assertion. Let's see if he says which issues. But suffice it to say, he's not going to say which issues, that such postmodernist materialism is to be found in the pseudo-Nietzschean Heideggerian ontology, the logic of material being in its supposed revelations, contra Hegelianism. Contra what in Hegelianism? Like, Marxist Hegelianism isn't pure Hegel. We've already gone over this. Anyway, this is the present common sense that Turley expresses. Well, you haven't really said what it is, other than that there's an ontology here, but the ontology arguments aren't in what Turley said. Turley's main argument was that what Lukács was defending was the Lenin of 1919 to 1921, which he sees as an ultra-leftist deviation, at least in the way it is defended by Lukács in that period. Lukács himself would qualify this. and why he must read Lukács as self-contradictory in certain ways. Okay, but what ways? This is a frustrating thing, and Chris will defend this by saying he's trying to get you to think. But think about what? Like, what are the specific issues? Let's see if he clarifies again. So far, he keeps on alluding to issues and then avoiding them. And I have had this issue with Chris Cutrone since I was in Platypus. Sometimes you can get him to be specific, and often you have to challenge him to do so. So I find often when he responds to these things, he actually is clarifying. But in his initial pieces, you can project a lot on what he's saying, and you may not actually agree with him. He might think that's a good thing. I mean, Adorno also wrote that way with a certain vagueness to allow for multiple interpretations and instantiations to emerge. If that's the style, I wish Chris would say so, but he also does a lot of decorations and assertions. All right. Lukács' early Marxist works were only ever obscure to the New Left and so prone to bottlization. I agree with that, although I'd like to know which bottlizations you think are relevant. Specifically, given what was said in the initial Turley essay, and have only become more so since. Can you give us an example? I realize this is a letter, and I realize this is probably written very quickly. So I'm willing to straighten that out. So, Chris, if you want to provide examples from the thing that you wrote 11 years ago, go ahead. It is noteworthy that, in Turley's view, the only positive claim one is left with regarding Lukács is that beyond a commendable revolutionary elan, Lukács is good in his criticism of Kant, Fichte, and Hegel. In the section Antinomies of Bourgeois Thought, Part 2 of the Reification Essay in History and Class Consciousness. But Turley thinks the limits of Lukács' materialism and hence of his Marxism are with regard to how he conceives of the empirical experience of the working class in capitalism. This involves, according to Turley, a short circuit in which a confrontation with the struggle of employee with employer is already socialism, whereas Turley thinks that this neglects political mediations in an ultra-left manner. But while in Turley's characterization it could, it in fact doesn't. Okay, how? I think Chris actually is going to answer this. Lukács was addressing how it was precisely in the struggle for proletarian socialism, in the era of the high point of the Second International Marxism, the problem of reification manifested itself. For Lukács, reification meant Bebel and Kautsky's SPD in theory and in practice. Then why, Chris, does he mention that so little? Why so many references to worker self-activity, to the revolution in Russia, to Luxembourg, and not to Bebel and Kautsky? Like, I think there's a few references to Adler and Kautsky in History and Class Consciousness, and maybe a reference to Bebel. I would have to go back and check, but that doesn't seem to be the predominance of the essay, and Lukács definitely knew that stuff enough to go into it. So I don't know why you're saying that it's just about the Second International. Is it about the overcoming of the Second International as manifested by Lenin? I could see that reading, but again, why doesn't Lukács make this explicit? What makes Lukács' early 1920 work so difficult to read today is that we lack Lukács' object of critique. The Second International, sure, although again, he could have made it explicit, and you could have made some of your points more explicit too. So his argument becomes objectless and seen as speculative in the worst sense. I will say that I've read History and Class Consciousness in total now 4 times. I've read essays of it several times with Doug Lane. I've talked about it with multiple thinkers. I have gone from hating it to being torn on it. I still don't like the methodology essay. I think the central reification essay is actually really fascinating, but maybe totalizing in a way beyond just the normal Marxist use of the word totality. But let's continue. We do not have a second international in crisis. We do not have the second international in crisis 1914 to 1919, but something much worse in our political reality today. Okay, what's the something? Do you see why people get, and it's not just me, do you see why people get frustrated with Chris's vagueness? All right, but he's right. The context of the Second International is poorly understood. It was better understood now, although I would say if people understood it, it would be Platypus Affiliated Society and the Communist Party of Great Vision Provisional Committee, since a lot of those members, like Ben Lewis and Mike McNair, have spent a lot of time analyzing the key documents and translating the key documents of the Second International, many of which are still not available in English. So why wouldn't they pick it up? Maybe Turley wouldn't pick it up. We'll see. This makes it difficult to grasp Lukács's argument. Only if we accept that that is the primary argument. I do think the Second International and the specific conditions of the early third, which we also don't have today, are 10 years ago, do necessitate being careful here. So, I mean, I think this is a valid point as far as like why Lukács got misappropriated by the New Left. And he was. I mean, I could totally agree with Chris that a lot of the Lukácsian readings from the New Left are bad readings of Lukács. I think I said, Donna Haraway, Sandra Harding, those guys, they were Lukácsians. There's lots of weird uses of Lukács in the 60s and 70s. There's lots of weird uses of Lukács today. In fact, Lukács was engaged in self-critique of the crisis of Marxism and the collapse of the Second International, and in the difficulties of reformulating Marxism and as revolutionary politics by Lenin. Okay, so that statement is more clear than the first statement about the Second International. And I think Chris has a point here. I'm going to give him a point on that. Luxemburg and Trotsky and their comrades in the Third International. But their failure was not due to an error in thinking supposedly condensed in Lukács. Okay, what's their failure due to? We lack the basis for the imminence of Lukács's critique of the newly formulated Third International, while Lukács thought he was making a vital contribution to addressing the political problems of the time. And so Lukács's work appears as an intellectual exercise in the most limited sense. But this merely projects the potential limitations of our own reading today into the text. Bereft of the original concrete context, the comparatively high-level political disputes within a fledgling Third International of 1919 to 1922. This is actually kind of a sound point. I'm going to give Chris salience here. And this salience actually makes his other point that I had issue with about the Second International clearer. So if we take the second reading that I proposed, that this is about the Second International in light of the emergence of the Third, then yes, I do think that is a context for Lukács's writing. But what does that mean in terms of reification? And what does that mean in terms of 1921? Maybe that's more than we can ask because Chris is responding to Torley. Ultimately, Turley cannot go beyond Lukács's own self-criticism of history and consciousness, and that Lukács had tried mistakenly to out-Hegel Hegel. Hence, Turley cannot go beyond Lukács's own capitulation to Stalinism. Yeah, I will say that one of the things that I remember from being in Platypus is basically we don't read later Lukács Platypus that much. I wouldn't say not at all, but not a lot, because of the capitulation to Stalinism question. And having read the Taylism book, I'm not quite sure that that's all that's going on in there, but we'll come back. And as the materiality to which theory must supposedly discipline and subordinate itself. In this view, Lukács's own repudiation of his earlier work seems justified, but the justification of what happened to Marxism as critical theory as a function of Stalinism. It became intolerable. To save his skin, Lukács had to change his mind. I mean, I've heard this explanation a lot. I kind of buy it, but Lukács's later works beyond just the repudiation of history and class consciousness maintain this in a way that make it a little hard to totally explain away the shift in thinking by just he was trying to save his skin. But the real alternative is to try to change the world, whose failure Stalinism both expressed and reinforced. The question is, what happens to Marxism as critical theory when evacuated of its object of critique, when divorced from political practice? It degenerates. I mean, I'd agree with that. But this was not due to the antinomies of Lukács, but rather the degradation and liquidation of Marxism, and the resulting regression of history. The self-critique of Marxism, the Hegelian self-consciousness, cannot make sense when there is no Marxism politically. Chris Cutrone. In so much that I understand what Chris is saying here, and I think I do, I agree with it. That last little bit. That in so much as there's not a Marxist project, that some of these speculations are harder to understand. And the 60s contained Marxist projects, but they were half-formed and in a variety of unclear context. Now let's see how Turley responds. Dummy. Ouch. Chris Cutrone exemplifies the rather odd approach his platypus organization has to the anointed theoretical forebears. This is from February 21st, by the way, of the same year. And letters, January 31st. I do not recognize the depiction of myself as some kind of Lacanian Heideggerian, but this is by and by. Yeah, there's often an accusation of the core of a prior thinker ruining the thought of a later thinker, and then thus ruining the thoughts of people who apply it. It's almost like a genetic fallacy. I would have to say, though, in so much that one is an Althusserian, you are at least carrying Lacanian baggage. I don't know how you get around that. Unless you explicitly try to bracket the Lacanian elements of Althusser out, in which case you're taking a lot of Althusser out. More importantly, I do not recognize his brief presentation of Lukács. Lukács was addressing, apparently, how it was precisely in the struggle for proletarian socialism and the era of the high point of Second International Marxism, the problem of reification manifested itself. For Lukács, reification meant Bebel's and Kautsky's SPD in theory and in practice. How does Turley respond to this? The problem is that this is flatly inconsistent with the entire line of argument of history and class consciousness. Well, I did say I was also surprised because there's not a lot of mention of Bebel and Kautsky or many Second International figures at all in history and class consciousness. I mean, Luxemburg's kind of a Second International figure, but not just that. There's a clue, in fact, in the title. If Lukács had said the things attributed to him by Cutrone, then he would have been better off calling it Second International and Class Consciousness or some such title. In any case, this is a text in which Kautsky barely appears at all, and Bebel only as a recipient of a letter from Engels at the tail end of the critique of Rosa Luxemburg's text on the Roche of the Revolution. Where did the International appears at all? It is simply a subject of an utterly run-of-the-mill mass action left critique, as in certain footnotes on the final chapter of Organization. I don't know, Turley. I don't know that that's fairly encapsulating the fact that the failure of the Second International is the context for the Third International, of which Lukács is writing quite a bit about, and I think Chris does kind of state that. Reification in Lukács is not official Marxism. It is the entire structure of consciousness of bourgeois society. Well, Lukács does say that. As lived through pure categories of capital. This is not buried in some obscure footnote. It is laid out in a 200-page essay that constitutes the book's beating heart. I cited all the relevant passage in the original piece, so I'll not repeat my shameless quote mongering on this occasion. So one thing I don't always agree with what Turley's saying here, but Turley is more specific than Cutrone, which makes Cutrone a more slippery actor. It doesn't mean Cutrone's wrong. It's a rhetorical style he employs maddeningly, but one that if you can pin him down and speak to him correctly and kindly, or at least without taking the bait and losing your temper, which I have done many times, you can often get him to articulate more and actually expand upon. So let's see, maybe in a following letter, Chris will. So how is Cutrone able to turn Lukacs into this particular kind of ventriloquist dummy? I suppose the sting in the tail of the above-cited passage is the phrase, the problem of reification manifested itself. It would be possible to put Cutrone's words into Lukacs' mouth by taking it literally and using history and class consciousness as a meta-commentary on itself. Viz. The theory of reification, it's itself a product of reification's highest stage, rather than the fundamental category of capital and an expression of self-consciousness of society circa 1918 to 1922. I may, of course, be making a ventriloquist dummy out of Cutrone himself here, but that seems to be the implication of some of his statements. Okay, so we now understand the title. The title here is the ventriloquist dummy, not dummy as in fool or stupid, although the ambiguity is probably left there on purpose. What makes Lukács' early 1920s work so difficult to read today is that we lack Lukács' object of critique, so his argument becomes objectless and mere speculative in the worst sense. This would seem to imply that Lukács is only comprehensible in the specific headspace he occupied in 1918 and 1922, from which we are all irrevocably cut off. Yeah, it does seem to. I was thinking that maybe Cutrone is almost implying that you have to experience the qualia of political Marxism of that time period to really get into the headspace and understand the argument, in which case nobody could now, including Chris Cutrone. But I don't think that's what Chris is saying, but it could be read that way. I think we should probably take the heuristic of charity here and read it a little bit more fairly, but whatever. If this is Cutrone's argument, however, then the necessary consequence is a radicalized subjectivism, in which no individual or collective form from any historical situation can fully comprehend the product of any other historical situation. Ironically, that's a closer to Foucauldian point. I don't think Chris would agree with a Foucauldian point, but maybe. For those of you who don't know, that's a Foucauldian period where he was talking about epistemes and understanding epistemes. Cutrone himself must stop belly aching about the new left, for he was not yet born when it emerged. Oh, man. All right. That's funny. What Turley's getting at here is if we actually take this to be the case, then we can't critique the new left either, because those of us who are not alive and politically active, because we don't have its object either in our history in mind. And this whole exchange is equally pointless, for neither of us would have any grounds to justify our assertions concerning Lukács' significance. And it's me who supposedly has some kind of postmodernism. Yeah, although, Turley, that's not a fair argument. Like, I mean, it is a reductio ad absurdum of the strongest reading of Chris's argument, but I'm not sure that's helpful. More to the point, we have no way of assessing Lukács' relevance as a critique of his own time either. To put it in a very wild way, Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf is a product of the same historical context. The collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the disaster of World War I, the failure of the German Revolution. Why should Hitler's critique of the Second International Marxism be treated with any less respect than Lukács'? Okay, we went argumentum ad Hitlerum here? Okay. After all, we lacked his object of critique too, and surely we are unequally doomed to misinterpret the poor man. Okay. If he does not want to uphold some absurd historical relativism, then control is back to square one. Is he, though? I mean, you're taking the strongest reading of that point. He didn't say it was impossible. He said it was hard. And it is hard to recontextualize a historical text. I mean, and that was what Turley was trying to do. I feel like this gets around the key point, which is Lukács talking about Lenin's perspective in 1921 or not? He must evaluate Lukács' work according to the logical validity and empirio-historical accuracy of the claims he actually makes in his actual book. He must evaluate my critique equally according to the claims I actually make. For that matter, he must evaluate Lukács' 1967 self-critique according to the same calculus and not vulgarly dismiss it in the most worn-out new leftism manner as straightforward expression of his capitulation to Stalinism. I mean, you do need to make a little bit of a better argument there because it is mind reading. It's a logical mind reading. I mean, it is a logical deduction from the context, but it is speculative. So that point kind of lands. Personally, I would make the exact opposite claim to the comrade that the subsequent 90 years of history, along with the countless theoretical arguments concerning history, class consciousness, and history and class consciousness, make evaluating Lukács' work easier, forcing him into the Procrustean bed of the platypus tradition, which chops and stretches everyone from Adorno to the pseudo-Trotskyist shrieking of the Spartacist League into the same mutilated shape, presents, on the other hand, a serious obstacle to doing so. James Turley, London. I don't know. I think there's two solid points in there, and then some might equal frustration about vagueness. But it does seem like you're taking the strongest possible reading and deducing reductio ad absurdum from it. But the plain text reading actually isn't quite that, and that's not particularly fair. Okay. What does Cutrone say back? Nota bene. James Turley seems to distinguish between regarding bourgeois society as a whole and the Social Democratic Party and the Second International in the crisis of World War I as exhibiting what Lukács called the problem of reification, as if the workers' movement were somehow apart from bourgeois society. The workers' movement was part of bourgeois society. That's true. Let's see how it's relevant. This is from February 28th, so this is 7 days later. Chris is writing quickly. Has the dialectic been rolled out of court? No. Self-contradictions and no need for self-overcoming transforms in the history of Marxism. The subtitle of Lukács' book, History and Class Consciousness with Studies in Marxist Dialectics. Hurley doesn't consider that this could have been called Studies in the Dialectics of Marxism. For Hegelian and thus Marxist dialectics is not intrinsic to its object, but rather critically reflective of it. How to understand history from within the process of historical development. Yes, although Hegel's Our Manova does seem relevant here. I think I agree with Chris, though. At stake here is not historical relativism, but rather the dialectics of history. Was Marxism historically subject to self-contradiction? Yes, of course it was. I mean, that's me talking, but duh. Turley appears to dismiss the possibility. I'm not sure that you two aren't talking past each other. Where this was Lukács' central concern in history and class consciousness. Like many readers, Turley saunders the two parts of Lukács' title, History and Class Consciousness, rather than regarding their intrinsic interrelation for Marxists. Class consciousness is the consciousness of history, especially of its dialectical contradictions. Class consciousness is consciousness that emerges in history when an object moves from in itself to for itself. So I talk about this in a rather vague way, and I think Chris would probably object to the way I phrase this, but when the aggregate, which is a sociological reality, becomes conscious and becomes a collective, a political reality with its own self-understandings. So you can move from short-term and immediate interpersonal consciousness to long-term consciousness. Now, there's a lot of abuse of the term class consciousness. A lot of people just mean it as doesn't think like me, or working class doesn't do what I want. And there's a lot of abuse of the in itself and for itself distinction. In fact, I've argued with platypus members, not Chris, actually, and not Spencer Leonard or Richard Rubin, but other members about this in the past. where I said you can abuse the for itself by claiming things that aren't emergent from the in itself are inherently for itself in some way that posits that exist in space, which it doesn't. It's emergent. It's an emergent quality, even if you are Hegelian or a Hegelian Marxist. And the emergence from material history is the important thing here, as opposed to emergence of the absolute ideal. That's the difference, right? We went over that in my responses to Chris last time, and I don't think Chris disagrees with that. So, yeah, fine, good, solid point. Turley simultaneously condemns Lukács for Hegelianism, then tries to defend Lukács against my characterizations of history and class consciousness as essentially Hegelianism. There is no dialectic of theory and practice in the history of Marxism worth considering. Are we left only with the standards of historicism in regards to the history of Marxism? Is there no place for what Hegel calls the philosophical history in Turley's consideration of the history of Marxism? This is not a matter of some supposed willful Procrustean misinterpretation of historical Marxism, but rather finding the red thread that links Marx, Engels, Lenin, Luxemburg, Trotsky, Lukács, and Adorno, amongst others. Those are the platypus big guys and woman. That is the eminent dialectical critique of the workers' movement for socialism, including the self-reflection of Marxism or Marxism's dreaded Hegelianism, which Turley seems eager to cut in favor of the standard pre-Kantian, pre-critical, naive bourgeois thought long in its innocence was lost in the late 19th century. Why? Or worse, Althusserian anti-Hegelianism, not merely sub-bourgeois, but avoidedly pre-Socratic? I think this has to do with the aleatory materialism claims. I don't... Okay, I'm going to say I get this is polemical, but I think you're going to have to... I was with you until you say that Althusserianism is pre-Socratic. I think I know what you mean, but you don't give me the criterion in which is pre-Socratic, so I don't know that I know what you mean. I think you mean that the aleatory materialism and the structuralism is similar to the ways of thinking of pre-Socratic philosophers. I don't know why you maybe don't mention Spinoza as being a problem here, but whatever. An exemplary case of regression in history of Marxism, just as, and indeed owing to Heidegger's anti-bourgeois regressions in the history of philosophy. I mean, I agree with Heidegger that Heidegger has anti-bourgeois regressions in the history of philosophy, but I would like to know what specific ones are at play here. Is it the ontic or ontology as mentioned above? And in which case, how do you tie that into what Turley actually says? In Turley's view, the reactionary anti-bourgeois character of Heidegger's philosophy would not be the expression of the reactionary anti-bourgeois politics of Nazism that Heidegger joined, or the regression of bourgeois society and fascism, but somehow apart from it. Ouch. Indeed, sorry, Turley, you did do the argumentum ad Hitlerum and open yourself up to this. Indeed, we may not be able to fully understand the historical moment of Hitler's Mein Kampf in the present. History does grant us some small mercies, but Hitler was not merely wrong-handed. Millions joined Nazism for some reason, not simply for the lack of reason. But I thought we were discussing not the right, but the left, and Marxism in particular. Lenin warned in his testament that the Bolshevik theorist Bukharin perhaps never understood dialectics, and so could not quite be considered as fully Marxist. The leading Bolshevik theorist. This was in the same year as writing Lukács' History and Class Consciousness. Neither Lukács' critique of the historic crisis of Marxism nor Lenin's warning about the legacy of Bolshevism was heeded. Nota bene, Chris Cutrone, Platypus Affiliated Society, probably Chicago. And Turley responds, bacon. Uh-oh. Chris Cutrone ducks, dives, and weaves, but does not answer the challenge in my treatise in the letter, namely how to deal with Lukács and my argument as they actually are, not as he would like them to be. I don't know. He answers some of your arguments in that letter, but he doesn't answer many of the things that were originally brought up in the initial article. I'll give you that. I think the second letter is far more clear than the first one, and actually does deal with things directly said, though. So just saying he ducks it doesn't seem totally fair. Again, Lukács' History and Class Consciousness is recast as a critique of the Second International, a subject on which it says almost nothing. 5 or so pages of polemic in the first chapter against Hilferding and Max Adler. Yeah, I forgot Hilferding was in there. Plus a few scattered and unenlightening footnotes. Indeed, a subject on which, as it is clear from Lukács's later Lenin, a study in the unity of the thought, the author was pretty ignorant. Really? Okay. I would like... Okay, so I've challenged Chris on this. I'd like Turley to tell me how. How was Lukács ignorant? For pointing out the blindingly obvious that Lukács was talking about history and class consciousness in bourgeois society as such, I'm accused, on one hand, of erecting a Chinese wall between bourgeois society and the Second International as a component of it, and on the other, even more oddly, of artificially separating Lukács's account of history from his account of class consciousness. The first argument is simply facile. I do not never have argued that the Second International existed in some sublime separation from bourgeois society in general, only that Lukács's arguments are pitched at the latter, higher level of generality, and must be assessed as such. Fair. Actually, that's a fair retort. They are much stronger on that ground, for what it is worth, than they are of a critique of the Second International Marxism, which Lukács only treats in caricature. Again, I'd love to get what the caricature is. All right, I've read the book, but I'd like to know what you think is at hand. I wish both these people would give more examples of what they think is the problem. The second argument, again, misses the point. Of course, history and class consciousness are extremely linked in Lukács's view. I only argue that his view of this relationship, the self-consciousness of historical reality line, is ultimately idealist. Well, in what way? And thus contrary to the core premises of what is properly called orthodox Marxism. Indeed, contrary to Lukács's description of the latter as a scientific conviction. In what way does Lukács mean scientific conviction? What way does Althusser mean scientific conviction? Neither one of them seem quite the same way that we today mean scientific conviction. So, I mean, I know that's what's said, but let's go more here. Instead, we face the oldest cliche in the Hegelian Marxist book. Hegelian and thus Marxist dialectics is not intrinsic to its object, but rather equally reflective of it, and how to understand history from the process within the process of historical development. This, I am afraid, is a problem which tortures Hegelian Marxists exclusively. You do not hear many theoretical physicists tormenting themselves with the problem of understanding quarks, Higgs fields, and the rest while being composed and constituted by them. There is no search for the elusive Archimedean point. They do the maths, do the experiments, and get on with the rather unromantic business of incrementally improving our knowledge of the natural world. True. Although this is going to hit Marx more than Turley thinks, if he stands by this. Because that epistemological break stuff, there's a shift in concern, there's a shift in vocabulary, there is a change in how Marx approaches Hegel. But there's never an abandonment of Hegel for some new epistemology. That's kind of an Althusserian myth. There are shifts in Marxist thought in time. I don't think you can read it as a grand unified field theory. I've often complained that Platypus overly focuses on early Marx, but a lot of people don't focus enough on early Marx, and so the corrective might make sense. Does this mean the dialectic is ruled out of court? No, because the scientific understanding of history requires understanding it as a process, as the interaction of contradictory elements that are distinct as they are inseparable. Dialectical thought, in one form or another, is rendered indispensable simply by the demands placed on the historical materialism by the nature of its object, such as the complex mathematical systems that form the core theoretical physics are made necessary in that domain. So we see here that I think Turley's not willing to go as far as Althusser is throwing the dialectic out. Okay, cool. The proper and scientifically justified use of extraction and analysis of contradictions is the difference between, say, viewing the present economic crisis as an incomprehensible calamity caused by a little dodgy mortgage trading and viewing it as the outcome of determinate economic and political processes. It's often joked that such a predictive power of Marxism that we have foreseen 10 out of the last 5 crises, but that is still better hit rate than the big fat zero predicted by bourgeois economics. Yeah, it is. Although the joke's kind of true, we are often predicting crises that don't happen. By conceiving dialectics in a strictly Hegelian fashion, however, Lukács commits himself to a far stronger claim for its utility than can be justified by references to the mundane reality. Hence his hostility to facts and experimentation, which is contemplation at its purest. Yeah, I never liked that part of Lukács either. Which is that, in the form of Marxism, the imputed class consciousness of the proletariat, it is the self-understanding of history. As I argued in my essay, this leads him necessarily because nature must either be cleaved from or folded into history. Why is that necessarily idealism? Again, I was with you for the last 3 paragraphs, but you lost me at this last bit. Even worse, history for Lukács and equally has its hour of maneuver, despite his criticism of this motif in Hegel. History may not have actually been completed, but we are told in no certain terms that the end will be. Are there no self-contradictions and no need for self-unaccompanying transformations in the history of Marxism, Cutrone asks? Of course there are. Strip out the jargon, and this is nothing more exotic than the scientific method. I don't know that it is actually that. But in Hegelianism as a method, and thereby Marxism, it is conceived by Lukács, there cannot be, because the Hegelian method is an exercise in circular self-justification. Ouch. But also, prove it. So much for Lukács. What words are put in my mouth this time? Apparently things are going from bad to worse. From having been some kind of Lacanian Hegelian, I have become avowedly pre-Socratic. Well, actually, he said that Althusser was avowedly pre-Socratic. It is as much a surprise to me as to anyone else, as we seem to be faced with the sort of 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon school of ideology critique here. Yeah, that's frustrating. I really wish the criterion of which the accusation of pre-Socratic was thrown was stated, because that would actually make that more clear to debate. I think I get it, but again, I had to add it, and I'm not sure I added the right thing. Viz, I quote Althusser, therefore I endorse Althusser's work in total, therefore I endorse his late enthusiasm for Epicurus and Heidegger, and simultaneously his enthusiasm for Lacan, a feat he never managed himself. Therefore, I am a pre-Socratic Lacanian Heideggerian. What a particular diagnosis indeed. It is that genealogy, genetic criticism again. After all, Lacan was a Hegelian. I mean, it was a weird Hegel thought read through Freud and Kojève, but yeah, I guess. But not the same kind of Hegel as Marx. His work is full of dialectics of this and that, and his principal innovation in that psychoanalysis is to bring the heterodox Hegelianism via Alexandre Kojève, yep, there we go, to the table, along ladder with Levi-Strauss's structural anthropology. The Heideggerian component of post-structuralism comes later, principally through Derrida, a lapsed Sartrean. Even worse is the small matter that Hegel himself openly advocated versions of pre-Socratic philosophy. The transition from being to becoming, which according to Georg Lukács contains the whole of Hegel's philosophy, is in fact more or less lifted from an aphorism of the pre-Socratic Heraclitus. Yeah, and a lot of people make a lot of hay at this. See Midwestern Marxist book about the topic. Thank you, Garrido. Heraclitus versus Parmenides explains it all, but it doesn't really at all. Anyway, for clarity's sake, my interest in Althusser is in his militant defense of that vulgar thesis, that ideology and science are epistemologically distinct and irreconcilably opposed. I wish that was true. He defends it reasonably well in some places and terribly in others, and makes a series of interesting and provocative points along the way. I do not buy the materialism of the encounter, which Cutrone is so keen to pin on me, nor do I buy Freud and Lacan, although his clandestine critiques of Lacan are interesting. As for Heidegger, the whole point of his philosophy is the exact reverse of the militant defense of the sovereignty of science. It is a straightforwardly irrationalist onslaught. I shouldn't have to refute this charge. James Turley, London. Thus ends what seems like two people kind of talking past each other. I am sympathetic to most of the points made in Cutrone's last letter, but I do think it actually isn't what the debate was originally about. And I am also frustrated by this genealogical genetic thing that Cutrone does in his assertions of an entire career, as if an entire career can be encapsulated in a name, and then you can draw the genealogies and arguments and pin them on anyone who cites them to court in a symptomatic way. I've always been frustrated by that. I've never been particularly convinced by it, but Cutrone makes many good points in this essay, with these letters, anyway. And so I do think that's fair. The second letter Cutrone writes is actually hits pretty hard. The response, though, that Turley writes does point out that Cutrone still dodged some of the things, and they're both talking past each other and throwing insults at each other in a way that I don't feel like I'm clarified by entirely what either of them think. I will say, though, that part of the problem is we have one group that has one set of methodological and epistemological and political commitments, one that is pretty close to classical Marxism, and one that picks up Althusserian structuralism, strips out a lot of the stuff, adds some of the Hegel back, focuses on developments between the Second and Third International. I just know this because I read a lot of Turley and McNair and Co.'s other writings, and tries to critique the problems of Lukács from that. I'm still not sure that I understand Lukács any better from this debate. But I do think some of Chris's points about the historical context and the imminence of critique do point out the difficulty of reading Lukács today. I also think he does dodge the fact that attributing all his later reversals to Stalinism and not any sincere belief, or that there's a maybe both are true, that's a harder thing to throw out exactly, particularly when he's maintaining it in 1969, where his head's not really on the chopping block in the same way. Hard to say. But we have some more to get into. We're going to get into Lawrence Parker's moderated defense of Lukács, Cutrone's response, and then I have another video on Mike McNair's response. And maybe we'll come to some conclusions by the end of this thing. Then we'll give Chris and the CPGB a break for a little while. I will come back to them. I might, and I've told you at the beginning with the other things we might be reading in the Radical Engagement series. So be looking out for that. There's going to be a lot more. Those who keep asking if I want to have Chris on my show, I think I'll be doing this off and on for a while, because I do think whatever you think of Chris Cutrone's politics, not engaging with him seriously is kind of avoiding a difficult question. As frustrating as it can sometimes be, I have grown from my engagements with Chris, even when they are hostile and even when we don't come to any mutual understanding. I find Chris engages pretty clearly in writing, and if you try to be as fair and thorough as possible, he'll be pretty fair to you. Although not always. I mean, the polemical letters between him and other people are kind of hilariously, they often get hilariously Barbie and seem to somehow miss the original point. Chris would disagree with me, obviously, on that, but you can decide. But Chris will be invited on the show at the end of some point of this to talk. He's already got his own show on Sublation. You don't mean me to host him all the time. But I do think a writer response, beyond just me reading his comments and responding to him, because I obviously am in control of that, is fair. But give me the time to go through the text so Chris can gather his thoughts and respond to me. And yes, this would probably be better as a series of essays, but as people say, people don't read it. So yeah, and I do get a little offended that you guys think I'm doing this for money, because I do get paid from Patreon, but I don't get paid anything off the YouTube, guys. I don't monetize my YouTube. I don't even really care if a lot of people watch them. Trust me. Some of these videos have a fair amount of watch. Some of them have very little. I don't give a shit. Clearly. That's not why I'm doing this. So I think this way. When I write, I actually do this first. This whole weird talking to yourself thing. And then I take notes, and then I write an essay, and then I do it again, and then I revise it. That's the process. And that's writing political essays for me when I used to do it. If I did it right, it took me a very long time. So the reason why I'm doing this way is I have so many projects on the back burner that this is just the best way for me to engage with it. And also actually probably give access to it to more people, including both Turley and Chris's work. And so that's why I'm doing it. You might like it. You might not like it. I don't really care. Like and subscribe. Hit the bell. If you want more, you can go to the Patreon. But if you don't want a Patreon, you don't want to give me $3 a month, I completely understand. Just if you think people will benefit from this, share this. Comment. I don't mind negative comments. I might mock you or challenge you. Sometimes I actually might agree with you. There's been people who point stuff out to me that I miss all the time. Thinking is better as a collective activity. You do it alone, but other people's input build on you. It's a dialogue and a dialectic. And so if you want to participate, you're helping me, you're helping yourself. I'd like to thank Chris Cutrone for being so patient with me. I'd like to thank the Weekly Worker for giving me so much to read, since I've read it now I read both it and Platypus and Cosmonaut Magazine regularly for a Weekly Worker for well over 13 years, Platypus for well over 15 years, and Cosmonaut since they've started. So I've read them first kind of in opposition, and as time has gone on, I've become more sympathetic to positions of certain writers there. So I hope you guys who aren't involved in this or don't care, check all this stuff out and make your own decisions. I agree with Chris that me talking to you about text, even when I read the whole thing, is not a substitute for engaging it with yourself, getting these text out, opening up on your computer or iBook or printing it out and taking notes. See what you think. Engage with the text. I know there are other things to do. There are always 1,000 things to do. And you need to do them. That practice needs to be active. It's not just scholarly, but do the scholarly practice too. All right. Keep your peace. Engage with us as best you can. Have a great day.